Thank you, Doug. Can you all hear me now? Yeah. Okay. And I just want to mention, too, and I didn't tell Doug this, that I am an out-of-state member of the Milwaukee Civil War Roundtable, so I'm going to try my best to make it here in October and come back. And thus my Iron Brigade Association membership. I learned a little bit about the military side of Ephraim Dawes while reading about his famous brother, Rufus. Neither Rufus nor Ephraim can be considered household names to most people, but to Civil War historians, of which I like to consider myself being, Rufus Dawes is certainly famous, and rightfully so. His battlefield exploits are remarkable and well known, and he has been mentioned and quoted by many well-known Civil War authors for decades. I learned a lot more about Rufus and Ephraim Dawes during private research. There are hundreds of letters and journals, many archived at the Dawes Arboretum History Center in Newark, Ohio. And we're fortunate today to have Leslie Wagner, the historian with the Dawes Arboretum, in the very front row. Wave, Leslie. They all reveal amazing life stories, never previously published. Not just the military exploits of the two brothers, which are truly exceptional, but the fascinating stories of the family and friends at home and fellow soldiers. During the war, of course, but also before and after, all occurring during periods of intense national and personal turmoil. It was a story I felt needed to be told, and that led to my book, To My Best Girl. I refer to it as a historical thriller because there's always something new popping up that you just don't expect. I think people of all generations can identify with these true-life small-town heroes. You no doubt know family members or friends who have faced similar trials during wartime, either on a battlefield or on the home front. So today we will focus on Ephraim's story outside of his famous brother Rufus. Rufus would undoubtedly endorse this well-deserved recognition of his younger brother. Much of this information that we'll go through today is gathered from Ephraim's own files, which were donated to the Newberry Library in Chicago by a niece, Mary Frances Dawes Beach, in the 1950s. You may want to remember those two names, Mary Frances. The first Civil War book I ever read was The Iron Brigade, authored by Alan T. Nolan. It was published in 1961. My copy is this 1994 issue, which was forwarded by Alan's friend Gary Gallagher, a Civil War historian many of you probably have listened to or seen or know, still around University of Virginia. Alan was a well-known attorney in Indianapolis. He also founded, or one of the founders of the Indianapolis Civil War Roundtable, which, as Doug mentioned, I'm the incoming president of, and very honored to be that. Alan used many first-person accounts, and foremost among them, I think, is Service with the 6th Wisconsin, the memoir published by Rufus Dawes in 1890. My copy is 1962, published during the centennial. I've had it for many years. It's full of my notes and marked up. It's in kind of bad shape, actually. Alan died in 2008. He was married to Jane. Between them, they had 8 children. So it was sort of like the Brady Bunch. They were both widowed, married each other, combined families. I found out several years ago that Jane lives pretty close to where I live in Indianapolis, about a 10-minute walk. She opened up Alan's library. My kids don't want any of this stuff, so help yourself. And I said, really? So one of the books that I found was the 1890 original that Alan acquired somehow in 1957, and look who it's signed by up on top. E.C. Dawes, the subject of our discussion today. So it's one of my cherished books for sure in the library. A little bit of history. Manasseh Cutler, Revolutionary War chaplain, and General Rufus Putnam, George Washington's chief engineer. After the war, the United States was ceded all of the area that is now then termed the Northwest Territory. Manasseh Cutler, remember the name Cutler, drafted the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 before our U.S. Constitution was even adopted. He framed it after the Massachusetts Constitution authored by John Adams from Boston, who he knew. His church was in Ipswich, Massachusetts, just north of Boston. They formed the Ohio Company of Associates, made up of Revolutionary War officers who had not been paid. So they had two schemes going here. One was to establish settlement parameters in the Northwest Territory, and also to use those unpaid warrants to buy land in the Northwest Territory, and that was the Ohio Company of Associates. Putnam led 48 pioneers, most of them Revolutionary War officers, down the Ohio, and they established Marietta, Ohio, the first settlement in the Northwest Territory. 7 years later, Manasseh's son Ephraim comes down the river with his wife and young family. He's only 28. It was a tough trip. They had to bury 2 of their children in the wilderness along the Ohio River. I can't imagine that happening. It's all recorded by David McCullough in his last book, The Pioneers. He focuses on 5 pioneers. These are 3 of them. Sarah Cutler is Ephraim's mother, Rufus's mother too, obviously. She marries Henry Dawes in 1829, and over 9 years or so of marriage, they had 5 children. Rufus was the youngest at that point. Henry Dawes was an abuser, mentally, physically. Sarah stood for it as long as she could, but it got pretty bad. The children were not exempt. She finally went to her father, Ephraim Cutler, who was living in the old stone house along the banks of the Ohio River. The painting is by Selah Bosworth. You may want to remember that last name as well. They separated in 1839. It had to go to the state Supreme Court at that time, any marriage breakup. So a lot of women, they didn't want the publicity. They lived with what they had to live with. Her father was a judge. And when Henry came back from a business trip and wanted to pick up his family there at the old stone house, Ephraim said, "So long, mister, I just want my daughter to live in peace, and my grandchildren are going to stay with me." And that's how that all happened. The original depositions are on file at the Marietta College Special Collections Library. Really fascinating reading. Thankfully for me, they were transcribed into a typed message, because you had all these different clerks, with different handwriting. And then down below, the pioneer is David McCullough. This is the old stone house here, the Ohio River. Vito Road here. Ephraim Cutler named this intersection Constitution, had a little post office there. There's a historical marker. The railroad running through there, this print was made in the 1870s. The railroad is still there. Here's the quarries that Ephraim owned, and he built his home out of limestone from the quarries. So Ephraim Cutler Dawes was born after the separation on May 27th, 1840. He's named after his grandfather, Ephraim Cutler. And here you see Ephraim Cutler down on the lower left. His mother, Sarah, who wore widow's garments after the separation her whole life. That's a later photograph. And Sarah's younger brother and sister, who all played huge roles in the raising of Sarah's children, Rufus and Ephraim included. That's her younger brother William and Julia, Uncle William and Aunt Julia. We'll talk more about both of them, but in particular, Aunt Julia. So it was an idyllic setting for her young kids to grow up in. They had chores to do, they had a farm, they had a beautiful garden, they had responsibility, and they learned a lot from their grandfather Ephraim until he passed away late in age, outliving both of his younger wives. Of course, his mother, very heartwarming, loving person, and aunt and uncle here who sort of took on a surrogate parent role in raising all the family. So here's a little map showing Marietta circled there along the winding Ohio River, and then Constitution, Ohio, which is where the old stone house is and where they all lived. And where's Henry? Well, Marietta was founded at the confluence of the Ohio River and the Muskingum River. And Henry, at his home and warehouse, is up in Malta, Ohio, in Morgan County, about 40 miles upstream. And what's interesting is at that time, the Muskingum River, which drains a good part of central Ohio, had a series of locks and dams that were built in the 1840s. It was being a public works guy, I was just amazed that some of those locks are still in business. There's a state employee actually who operates the lock by hand to let sailboats and other boats go up the Muskingum even today. But what about Henry Dawes? Here's Henry, the villain of the story, later in life. But he had a pretty impressive ancestry as well. His grandfather was William Billy Dawes from Boston. He was 30 years old when neighbor Joseph Warren, Dr. Joseph Warren, assigned Dawes and another gentleman named Paul Revere the assignment to Warren, Sam Adams, and who was the other one? I'm drawing a blank. At Lexington, that the British are coming. So that was the famous midnight ride. William Dawes, nobody really knows about him too much because Longfellow left him out of his poem. He had the land route. It was actually a longer route than Revere. They teamed up outside of Boston and joined by a young doctor named Prescott and warned the colonists that the British are coming. You know the story. Yeah. So a lot of people don't know that, but there's an organization called the William Dawes Who Rode Association that's still active today. Family members who were kind of slighted because nobody knows about William. So I'm going to read something out of the book. The 1850 census takers arrive at Henry's store and home and record the names and ages of all three sons now living there. Now, I have to go back. The family was allowed by the Supreme Court to live away from Henry, the father. But there's a catch. Henry appealed for possession, in quotes, of his three sons when they turned age 10. So when age 10 came around, Rufus took off, had to live with his father. So that was 2 years before Ephraim turned 10, and it was his turn. Their brother, Henry M., or they called Hen, was older. He was already with his father. So imagine being torn away from your family at age 10. I have a grandson age 10, and I look at him sometimes, and I'm wondering how he would react to that. To go from an idyllic setting, loving mother, loving aunt and uncle, to a father who was Mr. Mean, really. So anyway, here's the passage. Henry gives Rufus the middle initial R and tells the census man to record 10-year-old Ephraim as Daniel W., Daniel Webster Dawes. When I first saw that in my research, I wondered, who in the heck is Daniel W.? Henry, the vindictive father, still harbors the grudge against his father-in-law, Ephraim Cutler. Life with their father is harsh, especially for Ephraim, the black sheep. And Ephraim expresses this in a letter to his sisters. Remember, he just turned 10. Quote, "Father thinks I ain't more than a dog to hear him talk. No one could be more than a dog to live with him all his life. You dare not express an opinion of your own if it is in variance with any of his." So that's the sort of life that they had with their father. They worked in the warehouse, hard work. They went to school, but they didn't have a whole lot of fun. In September of 1856, Henry Dawes, the father, decides he wants to pick up sticks and go to Wisconsin. He had two older brothers, Dawes, who lived in Ripon. And so he bought some property near Mauston. And at this point, Ephraim is 16 years old, Rufus is 18, and he sends him to the university just started a few years earlier in Madison, a little school called the State University of Wisconsin. Ephraim goes first. He enrolls in the prep school, and they both live in North Hall on the University of Wisconsin campus. North Hall is still there today. Here's a copy of a letter that was written by the University of Wisconsin's first chancellor. Are there any UW alums here? Okay, you probably know the name. And he refers to Daniel W. Dawes, that's how he was enrolled by his father, completed his freshman year in this institution on the 28th. He has been uniformly successful as a scholar and unblemished in character and deportment. J.H. Lathrop, Chancellor. Now, Lathrop, I looked him up, actually went on to become the chancellor at Indiana University. Now, I'm a Purdue guy, so I have no love for Indiana University. And here's North Hall today in a winter scene that's still being used by the university. I toured it one evening when it was about 8 degrees outside and there were 15 inches of snow on the ground. Not the best time to go visit. But 2 years later, in the fall of 1858, Henry the father sort of has an epiphany and lets his two sons go to Marietta College in Marietta, Ohio, which is really where they wanted to go to begin with. Why the change? Well, I think there's two reasons. Number one, his father still had his business in Malta. The governor of the state, whose name was Salmon Chase, you may remember the name Chase, who was to become Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, appointed him to a political job. And the other reason is their older brother, Henry. Henry was old enough now, 20 years old. He graduated from Marietta College, and he told his father, leave my brothers alone, basically. If you don't, I'm coming after you. I'm bigger than you are, I'm going to get even. So Henry writes a letter to Ephraim, which Ephraim replies as follows from Marietta, February 18th, 1859. Now this is a year later. He had a choice. Ephraim had a choice. Your letter to Ruf, that's his brother Rufus, came to hand some days since. And I love the way he phrases this. By mature reflection, I have come to the conclusion that it would be better for me to stay here, that being Marietta. I can leave, if nothing else, learn to take care of myself. He's 18 at the time. A lesson which, I have to learn sometime. I presume now is as good a time as any. I'm getting along very well, both physically and mentally, as well, I suppose, as could be expected, because his father didn't give him a whole lot of money. I weigh 175 and have an expectant crop of whiskers. Your affectionate son, E.C. Dawes. And I get a kick out of how he phrased all that. The scene on the bottom left is Marietta around the 1840s. You can see the First Congregational Church here and Marietta College over there. Here's the Ohio River with the 2-mile-long Buckley Island there. And this is the Muskingum River coming in from the north. At the college, remember the building with the cupola? Here's the college today. That's Irwin Hall, still there. Oops. And from the same viewpoint, Marietta today with the Ohio River, Buckley Island, Marietta, and Harmer. When the pioneers came down the river, they landed first at Fort Harmer, which is right here, a little wooden stockade. 1860 rolls around. Ephraim is a junior now at Marietta College. They have a tragedy in the family. Their brother Hen passes away, their older brother who stood up for them. Rufus at the time is in Wisconsin with his father in Boston. He only had one senior term at Marietta College, Rufus did. He went to Wisconsin his first term. It was a 3-term year. Winter term at Marietta College, the spring, before he graduated, back with his father in Boston. It's a tale to tell, but I won't get into it now. But April 1861, of course, all the national turmoil that had been brewing for years, primarily over the slavery issue and expansion of it to further territories, and the election of Lincoln, who the Southern leaders did not trust, all erupted, as you know, to Fort Sumter and Charleston Harbor in April of 1861 in their Civil War. I mean, they're actually shooting at each other. And it's so interesting to read the letters back and forth, not only from Rufus and Ephraim, but from the family at home, the sisters and Mary Gates. Rufus, again, there he is with his top hat on, looking pretty dapper as a senior in college at Marietta. He immediately forms a company, recruits a company of soldiers from Juneau County. Boston is in Juneau County. There are a bunch of young lumberjacks and farm boys and circus performers and mechanics and you name it, anybody who could sign up. When they first got the call, Wisconsin only had one regiment assigned to it by President Lincoln, 780 men. He figured, well, I'm not going to stand a chance in getting into that regiment. So he draws up a pledge, and he signs 48 people the first day. The letter with all their signatures survives. I put it in the book. And he told them in the pledge that they're going to enlist for the duration of the war, however long it takes, and if Wisconsin can't use them, they'll go somewhere else. And they had to sign that. Well, he was thinking probably Marietta, because Marietta is right on the Ohio River. What's across the river? Virginia still, and plantations and slavery. And they were all worried about, people fording the river and invading Marietta. It would have been a pretty easy mark early on. So anyway, Rufus recruits the Lemon Weir Minutemen, and that's him in his captain uniform. They head to Madison by train. There was a train from Boston to Madison and on to Milwaukee. And they become Company K of the 6th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry. In July, they get sent to Washington, D.C. Why? First Battle of Bull Run happened. The North gets defeated badly, and the national Stanton, the War Department director, needs more troops. So the 5th Wisconsin, 6th Wisconsin both went out east. Not too many Wisconsin regiments out east. Most of them ended up in the Western Theater. Ephraim graduates in July of 1861. Rufus was supposed to graduate in 1860. They gave Rufus a degree anyway, and Rufus finds out about it riding the train going to Madison. And then let me read what Aunt Julia writes about Ephraim at this point of time. This is August 6th of 1861. Ephraim's Aunt Julia keeps a running account of domestic activity at home and major war news. She writes in her journal, "Eph seems determined to enter the volunteer army. This is to me a great trial. I cannot bear to have him go. Henry is dead, their older brother, Rufus in the army beyond recall, and now Ephraim." Now, at this point, I have to say, the family called him Eph, but for a long time, EPH, I was pronouncing it F. And, but I had dinner with a family descendant, and he said, no, it's Eph. The family always called him Uncle Eph, so Eph it is. He joins the 53rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry as adjutant. If you don't know what an adjutant is, it's a first lieutenant slot in a regular or in an Army infantry regiment. He's like the chief of staff. He's working directly under the colonel and the lieutenant colonel and the major. He's the paperwork guy. He keeps everything straight, issues the orders, keeps track of all of that. And Rufus said, you know, that's a lot of work, Ephraim. I wouldn't do it, but they wanted him, and so he did. He was an intelligent young man, college degree. So why did they do it? What was their motivation? I think a lot of it has to do, obviously, with patriotism. They had their ancestry on both sides, very active and influential in the Revolutionary War. They felt it was their duty to serve. They wanted to lead. They didn't want to join as a private. They wanted to lead. But they knew nothing about the military. They had no military training. They had no military inclination whatsoever before the war. But they're like many tens of thousands of people, young men on both sides, who had that verve to serve. I think initially they all thought, well, this is going to be over pretty quickly. Had no clue what it was actually going to turn out to be. But I just wrote this down. This is something Rufus wrote later in the war after he had seen a lot of action, a lot of gory blood and guts. That his belief in the cause, to which I have dedicated my life, if it is needed. And the cause I underlined because it was a phrase that George Washington used often in his correspondence to Congress looking for more money or to his wife back home. First under fire is not Rufus, though. They're pretty much marching back and forth in northern Virginia. Ephraim, however, is in an Ohio brigade, 3 regiments from Ohio. A brigade would be 3 or 4, maybe 5 regiments. Several brigades would form a division. Who's the division commander at the Shiloh battle in Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee, just north of the Mississippi River? The division commander is named William T. Sherman. And after the war, Ephraim penned a description of his experience at Shiloh, and he titled it "My First Day Under Fire." I found that recollection that he put together. It's multi-pages, and I contacted the American Civil War magazine, historynet.org, and just offered it to them to see if they wanted to print it as part of their story. They held it off until March of 22, just before the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Shiloh. Here's the cover. That's not Ephraim, that's Benjamin Grierson. But it became a centerfold article about 9 pages long. And that's the Shiloh church right here. That's what the battle is named after. Not much of a church, just a little log cabin. Ephraim's account is really gripping. Don't have time to go through it today, but basically that's his unit's tents right there. They were right on the front line when they were pretty much overrun by a massive Confederate assault that nobody expected. Least of all, William Sherman, despite the fact that he was warned by several people, including Ephraim's commanding officer, that, you know, there's something going on out there in those woods. There's a lot of, and so the pickets came in, and I just mentioned this, the lieutenant in charge who had the picket line is sort of the advanced guard out there. They're out, you know, quarter mile away. He's coming running back with his pickets, being chased by the Confederates, and he yells out to Ephraim, "The rebels out there are thicker than fleas in a dog's back." And then they get into battle, and Sherman still doesn't believe it. And when he hears all the firing, he rides up with his escort, and he's looking off in one direction with his binoculars, and Ephraim's within shouting distance, and he sees this whole Confederate line coming out of the woods, and they're doing this. And he yells out to Lieutenant Ball, "I called to Lieutenant Ball, Sherman will be shot." Ball turns around, looks at Sherman, "General, look to your right." Sherman looks to his right and says, "My God, we're attacked." Boom, they fire. He gets nicked in the hand, but his orderly right next to him is shot dead out of the saddle. Sherman takes off and said, "Hang on, I'll support you," you know, and finds some reinforcements. So that's how that all came down. Now, just before Doug and Leslie and I viewed the display upstairs, I hope you all get to see it. And there is a display there that includes Sherman's colonel epaulets that he gifted to Ephraim Dawes, and a little note underneath that refers to the Battle of Shiloh. I don't know. We don't know how or why it was donated. This may be the reason. I think Ephraim saved his life. You know, what would the Civil War have been like had Sherman been killed right at the get-go? Who knows? One of the great what-ifs. Well, the family at home hears about the battle 2 days later, and this is Aunt Julia's journal. I put her blog reference in the handout. I think you should really check it out. It's just an amazing journal that Peggy Dempsey, family member, put online some years ago. There's been desperate battle. Uncle William is telegraphed to learn of his safety. We don't know what it is. A week later, Ephraim, no letter came. There's no consolation. And next day, Kate, his sister, went to town to see if anything was known about Ephraim. We begin to feel very anxious for his safety, and the suspense is awful. April 17th, 10 days later, Julia names ladies that she knew whose sons were killed at Shiloh or badly wounded. And there is lamentation and weeping because of those who will return no more. And then finally, almost 2 weeks after the battle, they finally get a letter from her Eve. Thank God he is safe and did his duty. 1862, I won't get into this too much, but that's a picture of Ephraim. I'm not sure when it was taken, probably after the Battle of Shiloh, but in 1862, his unit, the 53rd Ohio, was doing a lot of marching back and forth all over the place in western Tennessee and in Grant's campaign in Mississippi, all with the goal of, you know, closing off the Mississippi, the great Anaconda Plan, and that they were very successful at in the long term. So those are just some of the places that he visited, but he's, you know, he just looks like a different person to me. His clothes are hanging on him. He's, you know, very thin and has that football running back look on his face, you know. For any military officer, the attainment of a field grade rank is pretty significant. And in the infantry and the Army, field grade is major, lieutenant colonel, colonel. Yeah. And the major symbol is the gold oak leaf still today. So in 1862, Ephraim knew it before the effective date. They were both promoted to major. Rufus first, went from captain to major, and there's a story. Anyone familiar with Frank Haskell, famous Wisconsin name? There's a story about Frank Haskell, who is the adjutant of the 6th Wisconsin that Rufus is in. He was a favorite of the colonel. You know, he sees the colonel all the time. He did an excellent officer, did a great job for him. The colonel, Colonel Cutler, no relation, wanted Haskell promoted to major when the slot opened up. And he made that known to everybody else, every officer in it. Now, these are volunteer regiments, Wisconsin, Ohio. The governors get to decide who gets promoted. So it often becomes kind of a political thing. But the opinion of the officers in the regiment matter. And there's an election, and Rufus, despite the fact that everybody, all the officers knew what their colonel wanted them to do, they voted for Rufus anyway, barely. So he gets promoted. And they felt, you know, it's not fair for a first lieutenant, an adjutant, even though he's an excellent officer, to jump over a captain and get the major slot. Well, sometime later, what happened to Ephraim? He's the first lieutenant, he's the adjutant. He jumps over all the captains and becomes major. So I wondered, you know, there's nothing written about it, but you just have to wonder how Rufus felt about his younger brother getting promoted. I'm sure he was happy for him. But there they are in their major uniforms, not only the epaulets, but the long frock coat with the 2 columns of brass buttons, 7 in each column. Meanwhile, Rufus in the 6th Wisconsin, they finally get battle late summer 1862 out east in Maryland and in Northern Virginia. They get involved with 4 bloody battles over a 3-week period. 1,600 casualties out of the 4 regiments, the 2nd, 6th, 7th Wisconsin, and the 19th Indiana. Those are the 4 regiments at the time. They earned the name Iron Brigade, and the newspapers spread it around all over the country. It becomes a famous unit, the only all-Western unit in the Army of the Potomac out east. And they're in the front of the battle on each one of those occasions. Here's Keith Rocco's painting of the 6th Wisconsin being led at that point by Rufus, coming out of the cornfield and into the Confederate line under Stonewall Jackson. They get mauled at all those battles. Now you think about 1,600 casualties, 4 regiments, that's 400 casualties killed and wounded per regiment. At that time, they probably only had 600 or 700 total. 2/3 casualties in that brigade. But the men were proud of their name, the Iron Brigade. They were forever after called. And even after the war, they were very, very proud of it. Iron Brigade Association. We're fortunate that both Rufus and Ephraim kept diaries, pocket diaries. This is Ephraim's in 1862. It's very small, and it's about 3.5 by 5.5 maybe. These are kept at the Newberry Library. And I just copied a couple pages out of his. This one in September 30th of 1863. I kind of got a kick out of it. No breakfast, rain and mud, hard marching, reached Vicksburg about noon, camped down on the Ohio Flat below the city. Now this is about 2.5 months after Grant has captured Vicksburg, so that was a siege, and the city and the residents there were, you know, really in bad shape. It's only 2.5 months later, but here's the last line. Went to the theater. Go figure, you know. So 1863, a lot of road trips for the 53rd Ohio and a lot of transfers. The Union Army transferred regiments all the time, and officers changed jobs all the time. not so much in the Confederate Army, and that was one big advantage the Confederate Army had, and I think one big reason why they lasted as long as they did. But the system of corps badges came to play in late 1862. So here's the 17th Corps badge, the arrow, the 16th Corps badge, and then finally one of my favorites, the 15th Corps badge with the cartridge box, 40 rounds US on it. And 15th Army Corps is the unit that pretty much after July of '63, the 53rd Ohio stuck with them. They were engaged in the siege of Vicksburg and at Tunnel Hill, which is actually outside of Chattanooga, the Battle of Chattanooga and Missionary Ridge, if you recall that. And here are the commanders of the 15th Corps at the time at Vicksburg and Chattanooga: Sherman and Logan during the following year in the Atlanta campaign. And then I just copied this, just a telegram from Uncle William P. Cutler, who was president of the Marietta and Cincinnati Railroad. And he's writing it to his sister, Mrs. Dawes. Heard nothing from Ephraim. Some further lists, newspaper casualty lists this morning, but Ephraim's name is not mentioned. And then to provide some solace for his sister Sarah, Sherman's loss is not so heavy, meaning Ephraim's corps. Also happening, of course, in 1863 in the Eastern Front is Rufus and the Battle of Gettysburg, in which, if you've ever been to Gettysburg, probably many of you have, he made fame at the railroad cut on the first day, July 1st. But in 1864, Ephraim's on leave. He spends a lot of time in Cincinnati, and we'll get into that in a minute. But he comes to Marietta in the old stone house on Christmas 1863, and here's Aunt Julia writing again. It's cold, but we were surprised and delighted by a visit from Major Ephraim C. Dawes and Lucy, his sister. Now, she didn't use Eph at that point. I think she's expressing pride in the fact that her nephew is a major. 4 days later, snow about 3 inches deep. Eph has been with his regiment constantly for more than a year. And then she goes in and lists all of his battles and skirmishes and the various units that he's in, from regiment to brigade to Army Corps to department. And it just showed me how clued in she was to what was going on and how impressed she was with the accomplishments of her nephew. And then the big day, Monday, January 18th, 1864. Close your ears if you don't want to learn about it in the book. Lieutenant Colonel R.R. Dawes and Miss Mary B. Gates were married this morning. Eph returned from Cincinnati. He'd been to Old Stone House, went to Cincinnati, came back for the wedding. They get married in this parlor at the Gates home before dawn on a cold January day. The parlor, as it exists today, it's part of the Betsy Mills Club in Marietta, Ohio. I was just there a couple weeks ago. Wonderful facility, community center, home for women. Mary's former bedroom is being used now by a woman who is getting away from a bad situation. They take off, Ephraim along with them, to Cincinnati right after the wedding. Where are they going? Well, here's Marietta. Rufus has a report to Milwaukee, so he's going to take the train. He's going to go through Kenosha, maybe like for the third time, up to Milwaukee to rejoin his unit, who is re-upped for 3 years. They got the requisite number, 75%, had to re-enlist for 3 years. If they did that, they kept their unit name, and they got a 30-day furlough. That was the big deal. But he was allowed to go to Marietta, get married, and then travel back to Milwaukee right away. Ephraim went along, and he stopped in Cincinnati. This is their Uncle William's Railroad, the Marietta and Cincinnati Railroad. It's a bike trail now, I think. And he spent some time in Cincinnati. We'll get into that in a minute. and then he takes off after that to join Sherman's army. So in 1864, U.S. Grant is the commander of all the Union armies nationwide. He decides he's going to stay in the East and headquarter with the Army of the Potomac. He puts Sherman in charge of the main thrust out west, being through Georgia. And they meet in Cincinnati, the two of them. And basically he says, Sherman, I want you to go after Joe Johnston in the west, and I'll go after Bobby Lee in the east. And that's what they did. So in the spring of 1864, the brutal overland campaign begins in the east, and Sherman's Atlanta campaign begins out of Chattanooga up here and heads down towards Atlanta. Right off the get-go, Ephraim's regiment gets transferred within the 15th Army Corps from 4th Division to 2nd Division. Why? I'm not so sure. Maybe one commander wanted that unit, or maybe they wanted to balance out forces. I don't really know. But right from the get-go after that, they get involved in the Battle of Resaca, Georgia. And then the battles of Dallas, which we'll get into, and on May 27th, 1864, is Ephraim's birthday. And here's what Aunt Julia writes in her journal. Eve is 24 years old today. How little we expected for him. Such a life of peril as he is now enduring. Sister Sarah Dawes sent down a letter just received. They would share letters back and forth with the family. He passed safely through the Battle of Resaca, Georgia. His regiment lost 47 killed and wounded and were highly complimented. Ephraim writes, they were perfectly wild with enthusiasm. Sherman's advance has thus far been a perfect success. And then she closes with, Eve's horse was shot from under him. Now, one of the benefits of being a field officer, major, lieutenant colonel, colonel, is you get to ride a horse, so you don't have to march. But in a battle, you're a big target, right? So a lot of horses get shot, and people riding them. So if you've been upstairs yet to view the uniform, May 27th is his birthday. May 28th, the next day, he gets shot at the Battle of Dallas. And on the left are his little pocket journal diary, and I'll read that to you. May 27th, Friday, my birthday. Lay all day long listening to the noise of the bullets above our heads. At dusk, moved forward to half-complete rifle pit under a very heavy musketry fire. Saturday, 28th, rebels charged our breastworks at 4 p.m., came close up, shot my lower jaw off, and I hurried off to Resaca. Suffered before reaching hospital. Dr. Nichols dressed my wound. Sunday the 29th, felt pretty bad. Can't imagine. Sore and weak, couldn't swallow. At night, moved hospital some 7 or 8 miles. Rode all the way in an ambulance. These were just wagons, basically, with no springs attached. Pretty hard, he writes. After the war, Ephraim wrote a recollection of the Battle of Dallas, and this is part of it. It's multi-page, so I won't get into all of it. This is Aunt Julia's transcription of it, but I'll just read you a little bit, so when you're looking at the uniform upstairs, you can kind of get a feel for what happened. Again, they were behind breastworks. Confederates were charging. The Ohio unit fired. A lot of the Confederates went down, but they had a couple battle flags and a group of men that were bound and determined to run over the breastworks. And Ephraim, as a major on the left wing of his regiment, couldn't stand it, he said. I pointed my sword and called out, "Never let that flag cross the road." I turned on my heel to speak to Captain Davis of Company C when I was struck with a mini ball. You know what mini balls are? They're a conical lead 1-ounce bullet that's about usually 57 or 58 caliber, big, heavy round. The sensation was as if a red-hot iron had been thrust in my face with the speed of lightning. I fell flat on the ground. Before touching the earth, I had time to think, I am killed. No, for I can smell the powder and see where the bullets are striking and the dirt spurting up from the works, and hear the men cheering and firing. I scrambled to the rear on my hands and knees. About 20 yards back, I stopped, rose to my feet, steadying myself by a sapling, and cleared the blood and dust out of my throat, and began to investigate my injuries. I could only breathe by gasping. The lower jaw was apparently shattered to pieces. The chin was torn so that it hung down. The lower lip was entirely lost, and all the lower teeth except for 2. The tongue was hurt, but I couldn't tell how much. I found the angles of the jaw were all right, and that made me feel better. He was carried by stretcher bearers to Dr. Lair, the surgeon of his regiment, and then Ephraim continues. I was feeling pretty well by that time and wrote with my finger in the dust which covered the black cushion of the ambulance. Good for 30 days. 30 days off. Dr. Lair looked at me and shook his head and said, "Yes, much longer." So that was his experience being shot, and he managed to get back to the hospital where he was treated with basically just bandages. They moved him farther north to Kingston, and a couple of days later he managed to send a telegram off to his uncle, William Cutler, in charge of someone named J.J. Cochran, who probably worked for his uncle. "I am badly wounded, lower jaw shot off." Now imagine Uncle William getting this telegram. That's all he said, you know. Amazing. So here begins the saga of his trip back north. They told him, the field surgeons told him, don't go to an army hospital. Infection is rife, gangrene is common. Medical science knew nothing about bacteria. They didn't know about they didn't have antiseptics. They didn't know why it was needed. You may have a surgeon cutting off an arm and then having the same bloody hands working on somebody else right after it. It was gruesome. So he gets a trip, which he calls a trip of horror. On Wednesday, June 1st, remember he was shot on the 28th of May, so it was about 3 days later. He went from Kingston to Dalton, right here. Kingston's down below, Dallas is down here, with 30 other wounded in a boxcar. Dalton to Chattanooga, he got into a second-class passenger car, which was basically just seats with wooden benches. He sat in the back, facing the back, so nobody could look at him. He went along with his servant, Wesley Benson, who really probably saved his life, took care of him. Thursday, June 2nd, reached Chattanooga at 1 a.m. and found the hospital in the middle of the night. Treated very well, but left 5 p.m. that day for Nashville. June 3rd, after a trip I shall always look back to with a sense of horror, I reached Nashville at 4 p.m. and went to the Officer Hospital on College Hill. Now that's a 146-mile trip with 7 stops. He stayed there in Nashville for a couple days. Monday, June 6th, went to Louisville, put up at the Galt House, pretty famous hotel. There's a story about that I won't get into, but anyway, 180 miles, 9 stops. this is Nashville. 146-7, Chattanooga to Nashville. Monday, June 6th, went to, Louisville, I'm getting lost here. Went to Louisville, to the Galt House. Okay, there's Louisville on the Ohio River. At Louisville, he's joined by a friend of his, Will Stevenson, who used to be a college buddy. He had also served in the 53rd Ohio as the adjutant after Ephraim was promoted. And he was out of the service, and Uncle William had dispatched him down the Ohio River to meet with Ephraim and Wesley when they showed up. So from Louisville to Cincinnati, they went by boat up the Ohio River. And there in Cincinnati, he met with a Dr. Blackman, a renowned surgeon of the time, who was co-author of the Army Surgical Manual. They told him, if anybody can fix you, it's Dr. Blackman. Go see him. So he did, and Blackman looked at his horrible wound, taking the bandages off, said, well, you need to spend some time healing that up, do this, do that, make sure it's cleaned and so forth, and come back. I think maybe by October, I can do some surgery on you. So he spends about 3 months from Cincinnati. They go back to Marietta, Ohio, and the old stone house on Uncle William's Railroad. And he recovers there for about 3 months. And on September 22, 1864, he's back in Cincinnati for his surgery with Dr. Blackman. With him are his brother Rufus, who's now out of the service, and his sister Lucy. And here's what Ephraim wrote about the surgery. I won't go into a lot of detail, but here he writes, I came down into the operating room at 3 p.m. Dr. Blackman was there with a number of other surgeons to whom he introduced me. They were all interested in this landmark surgery. A case of instruments containing, I should think, about 40 different kinds lay assorted on the table. I said to Dr. Blackman, well, doctor, are you going to use all of these on me? He answered affirmatively, and in such a matter-of-fact way that I knew he meant it, and it sent the cold chills move all through my body. He laid down on the table, and he continues, somebody, Dr. Gotrick, I think, administered chloroform. Just as I began to wonder when and how it would affect me, I seemed to be lifted up, up, up. I sailed millions of miles in the blue sky. In a moment, I seemed to be at the Battle of Dallas. I shouted and gave orders and finally began to identify a face in the line with Rufus and wondered, how did he get here? I lost all consciousness and then suddenly awoke. With closed eyes, I laid and collected my thoughts. I remember thinking, this operation must certainly be nearly over and I can certainly stand the rest of it. And I opened my eyes as I felt a sharp pain in the left of my face. Captain Williams of Cleveland, Ohio was holding my left hand. There were several officers there wounded who were there to assist. Dr. Blackman stood over me with a knife. Dr. Gotrick and Roof stood behind holding arteries. Another long cut convinced me he had just commenced. Dr. Blackman saw that I was awake and cautioned me to hold my head and right arm perfectly still. I will not attempt to describe the operation, but then he kind of goes on and does so anyway. And I won't get into it a whole lot, but just read a few excerpts. All of the visiting surgeons left the room. Now that's got to be a wide awaker, if they're not going to stay. When Dr. B, Blackman, was ready to bring the lips together, he had Dr. Hardy put in a temporary set of teeth he had prepared. I let these stay in till he sewed up the lip and stuck the steel pins there to hold it, and then threw them out underneath the new lip. It would have killed me to keep them in any longer. This nonplussed them a little bit, but Dr. B said, "Never mind, we can get along just as well without them." So he continues. There is one last tremendous cut that hurt worse than anything previous. He says, "I winced all over." Finally, Dr. Blackman said, "I guess you are done now. See if you can sit up." I got up sitting in a sitting posture, and he looked at me and said, "I must like 2 more stitches in the lower lip." I held up my finger for 1, but unavailingly. And at this point, Rufus tells the story. Rufus shouted out, "Doctor, don't do it." And at that point, Ephraim holds up 2 fingers like, "All right, do it, get it over with." Those 2 hurt worse than all the rest. I sat up again and held my hands before my face. All the room gathered around me. Finally, somebody said, "I do believe he wants a looking glass." I heard someone whisper, "No, don't bring it." The looking glass was brought, and I looked at myself. The first thought was because of the long steel pins, which really do not show in this picture adequately. I thought to myself, it looks like a turkey ready for roasting. It certainly did not look as though there would be much of a mouth. However, the awful operation was over. Dr. Blackman, who throughout the whole displayed the most wonderful nerve, drank a tumbler of brandy and sank exhausted in a chair. I got off the table and walked upstairs on my own power, prouder of the feat than of anything I had ever done in my whole life. But I was not unwilling to lie down when I reached my room. Rufus, after the operation, sends this telegram off to his mother. "Operation successfully performed. A fearful ordeal. Eve all right. R.R. Dawes." Lucy, his sister, stays there at the hospital for quite a while, September 21, the day before the surgery, till October 3rd, and she's there with Wesley to help take care of Ephraim. And she keeps a little diary too, which is at the Newberry Library, which is interesting to read. And goes on from day to day and how Ephraim is doing. And he is recovering remarkably well. Although he really can't eat anything, they're feeding him, I think, oyster soup and something, all liquid stuff. But here's something interesting, and it has to do with our next slide. And that's this passage here. And she's referring to her brother Rufus. Rufus went into the city, being Cincinnati, and brought Ella out to see Eve. Now, it's interesting, the Newberry Library, which has all of Ephraim's files, says nothing about Ella. But I learned about Ella through letters that Rufus and Mary exchanged in the spring after Ephraim was shot and before his surgery. So apparently, Ella is Ephraim's fiancée. That's why he was in Cincinnati so much. He had a love life. But who was she? The ladies of the family apparently met her when she visited Ephraim during his recovery after he was wounded, before his surgery. And that's Sarah, 12 o'clock spot, Aunt Julia, his sisters, Jane and Lucy, and then Mary Gates Dawes at the 9 o'clock position. So after that meeting, and the ladies of the family had a chance to meet Ella, Rufus gets a letter while he's in the Petersburg trenches, dodging sharpshooter bullets. He writes Mary a letter. I got a letter from Eve with a line from his girl enclosed. She writes very prettily. Tell me all about her when you have seen her. I got a letter from Kate also. I am afraid she is having hard times. But then Mary writes a few days later, the drama, and this is out of the book, the drama unfolding near Petersburg is almost matched at home. It involves Ephraim's love life. Lucy sends Ruth a letter questioning Ella's suitability as a wife for Ephraim, thus drawing him into the controversy. He penned this to Mary yesterday morning. I don't know what I can say or do about Eve. What can be done? Only to try to make Ella better when she becomes our sister? I cannot think Eve would be carried away with a woman about whom there is anything very wrong. But I have unlimited faith in Lucy's and your own intuitions of this young lady, and I feel troubled. And the ladies in the audience will enjoy this passage. It is said a woman's intuition of character is better than a man's judgment. That's from Rufus. Later on, he gets another letter from Mary, and he writes back, Rufus now writing, I think your suggestion regarding Ephraim and Ella, very good. I'm not sure what it is, but it will be a most unhappy task to say anything despairingly to him of one to whom he is engaged. But if I may avert the calamity of an awful marriage, I am willing to try in the way you suggest. It must have been a great trial for Mother Sarah, to speak disapprovingly of Ella to him. So, when your mother talks to you about the woman you want to marry, that's a big deal. So anyway, who is Ella? Well, obviously, I thought at first it might be somebody like this, an American sweetheart. Maybe a little bit older than Shirley Temple, but maybe a little younger than Mary Tyler Moore, American sweetheart. But then I thought, well, maybe it would be someone like this person. Sorry, Leslie. But no, the ladies of the family did not like her, it was obvious. So I got to thinking maybe she was something like this, Nurse Ratched. But I kind of like to think she's probably more like her, Scarlett O'Hara, be equal to the times. But we don't know. What we do know is that she was there in Cincinnati during the surgery and just after, but then Ella disappears. So after the war, he gets a medical discharge, obviously in October of 1864, it becomes official, and he's able to grow a beard, which he keeps all of his life to hide the scars. The only thing that you could see was a little bit above the chin. And he marries Frances Bosworth. Her father painted the old stone house. Francie, as Mary called her, was Mary Gates' cousin. Their mothers were sisters. So now they're sisters-in-law as well as cousins. And Ephraim gets involved, this is post-war, in the Marietta Railroad. He marries Francie in June of '66. He's at his father's passing in Mauston. And his father passes away in this farmhouse, which is still there. The family rents it out. Then he is involved in many other business dealings. He suffers through the financial panic of 1873, is bankrupt there, rebuilds, has a railroad supply pig iron business in Indianapolis, and then gets involved in other affairs, That's him in 1870. Him and Francis later on. He becomes a top collector of Civil War documentation, one of the finest collections in the country. When they developed the official records of the War of the Rebellion, the government consulted with him for accuracy. Here's an important thing. He published the papers of his great-grandfather, Reverend Manasseh Cutler, edited by his Uncle William and Aunt Julia. These are at the Marietta College Special Collections Library. David McCullough used those a lot in his book. He was a member of various societies, and here's a big one here, president of the Ohio Commandery of Mollis, the military officers of the Loyal Legion of the United States. He was elected president of the Ohio chapter. That's Ephraim in the uniform that's on display upstairs when he was president of the Ohio Commandery. He succeeded, by the way, two other former presidents of the organization. The first, Rutherford B. Hayes. The second, William Sherman. The third, Major Ephraim Dawes. Now, it just goes to show you what kind of esteem and respect they had for Ephraim Dawes. How old do you think he was at this picture? Only 48. He looks much older. Everything took a toll on him. He went on to become the president of the St. Louis and Big Muddy Coal Company, headquartered in St. Louis, a big southern Illinois coal company. But again, the panic of 1893 wiped him out. He died at his home in Cincinnati in 1895. He was not yet 55 years old. He's buried in Marietta, Ohio. I'd just like to take a few moments to do some personal recollections here. My first involvement with the Dawes story was from Peggy Dempsey, the descendant who married into the family. Her husband's great-grandmother was Mary Frances Beach, who donated most of this material to the Newberry Library. My first visit was to Leslie at the Arboretum in fall of 2015, I believe, not long ago, where many of the Rufus and Mary and Dawes records are. I think probably 40%, I'm guessing. Leslie said, well, you need to go to Marietta and meet Scott Britton and Linda Showalter. Scott, the historian at the castle, is everything Rufus Dawes, I remember Leslie telling me. We had a great discussion. Linda is the head of the Special Collections Library at Marietta College. And my favorite story is this. I spent a day with Leslie at the Arboretum, all day photographing letters. It was a 4-hour drive back home to Indianapolis. I was tired. I didn't want to do it. My wife was gone anyway to Arizona to visit her mom. Anyway, I decided I'll just go to Marietta. It's only an hour away. I'll spend the night there, do some more research. Did that at the Lafayette Hotel and went across the street to have dinner. The restaurant was busy. I sat at the bar, and while I was eating dinner, these two ladies came in. And we started a conversation over a shared basket of rolls. They asked what I was doing with my notebook. I told them I was writing a book about a local hero, this, that, and the other. Barb Moberg looks at me and introduces herself as the great-great-granddaughter of Rufus Dawes. I had no idea. What are the chances? I was just floored. And we got to talking more. Barb grew up in Libertyville, Illinois. She went to high school at Libertyville High School. As Doug mentioned, I was the public works director, maybe he didn't, in Libertyville, Illinois for 28 years. And I was a public works director. You get to know the town backwards and forwards. You get to know a lot of people. I knew the street she lived on. I knew the people she was neighbors with. I knew her high school boyfriend, you know, and the list goes on. Our kids went to Libertyville High School just like her. We had so much in common. It was just, I'm flabbergasted. And her companion that night, Judy Pearsall, married into the baseball Pearsall family. She's a direct descendant of Rufus Putnam. Remember him? The general who headed the pioneers heading down the Ohio River in 1788. We've been close friends ever since, and through Barb, I met many of the family members across the country. Here's Boston at the Descendants of William Dawes Who Wrote Association reunion in Boston in 2018, where I gifted the book to all the descendants who were there. The Haynes family in the St. Louis area, and the Young family, not very far from where I live in Indianapolis. Leslie's going to be visiting Teresa tomorrow evening, I believe. And of course, David McCullough. He wrote the book, The Pioneers. The night I met Barb and Judy, they said, boy, you should have been here last week because David McCullough was in town doing research on a book. And my first thought was, well, shoot, he stole my story. But no, he's writing about the pioneers, you know, the generation or two before that. He presented his book, The Pioneers, for the first time in Marietta, and Barb got us 3 tickets. My wife and my daughter and I went. We stayed at the Lafayette Hotel. Clued by Linda Showalter, I found out that David was staying there as well with 14 family members, and clued by Scott that he was giving a tour to David later that morning. I hatched a plan to stalk him, and it actually turned out to be successful because there's only one elevator in that old hotel on the Ohio River, and I knew he had to come down sometime. So I just had a cup of coffee at Starbucks there and waited for him, and sure enough, he shows up and introduced myself, and here I am looking kind of giddy because it actually worked. But David McCullough, my hero, greatest American historian, as you probably know, he passed away this past Sunday at age 89. His wife, Rosalie, preceded him, and just this past June. And when I met him at the Lafayette Hotel, eventually his wife came down. I met her, I met his family. But we had a chance to talk for about 15 minutes, just one-on-one over coffee. You know, it's something I'll never forget. Barb had gifted him my book, and before the year was out, he wrote me this letter, which I will always cherish, on his famous typewriter, thanking me for the book and our common friendship with people like Scott and Linda and Bill Reynolds from the Campus Martius Museum, and our common desire and love to be in Marietta. It's kind of my second home after doing all this research. So here's to you, David McCullough. So Rufus passed away about 4 years after his younger brother, Ephraim. After they died, the family erected these 2 identical obelisks in the Oak Grove Cemetery in Marietta, Ohio. It's a beautiful cemetery. The whole family is there, all the Gates family, the Bosworth family, the Dawes family. And the picture on the right is taken in 1912 at the home that Rufus and Mary lived in for 30 plus years. That's Mary on the left, and Francie on the right, sister-in-laws, cousins. And up on the wall is the sword that's on display here, Ephraim's sword. The other one is Rufus's. And the home is still there today. I've gotten to know the surgeon who lives there, had a tour of the home. The same fireplace, the same layout is just still the same. It's pretty amazing. And I would like to read you this letter as a closing. But before that, a little bit out of his biography that was done for Ephraim, and just a few excerpts that I thought were important. No one ever heard him use a vulgar word. No one ever knew him to do a mean thing. He was gifted with a mentality of the highest order that impressed itself at once to everyone in whom he came in contact. but his character was higher and greater than his mentality. Living his life under physical pain with that nameless shadow hanging over him, he was never heard to complain of his lot. And then years later, in 1905, his nephew, Rufus Cutler, Dawes, with offices in Chicago, and one of the handouts I hope you take explains the sons of Rufus and Mary and some of their accomplishments, many of them in Chicago. Rufus wrote this in February of 1905 to his Aunt Francie. Dear Aunt Frances, not long ago I met a Mr. Rexford of the city of Chicago. He came to my office and noticed the pictures of Father and Uncle Eph and learned they were old soldiers. And in the course of his talk about the war, he described the appearance of a wounded man walking from the field. His description seemed to agree so perfectly with the experiences of Uncle Eph that I copied from Father's book the account of Uncle Eph's experience and sent it to Mr. Rexford. I enclose you Mr. Rexford's reply, which I have just received. I think there is no doubt that Mr. Everett H. Rexford, Battery A, 1st Chicago Light Artillery, saw Uncle Eph immediately after his wound was received. He did not know who the officer was or what his command was, and before he learned that there was any possibility that this officer was in any way connected with me, he described it as one of the most pathetic and thrilling sights he witnessed during his experiences as a soldier. He said, quote, "When I was in Georgia during one of the battles near Dallas, I saw an officer walking unaided to the rear. He was tall and broad-shouldered. His step was perfectly firm and his figure erect. He had suffered a terrible wound. The lower part of his face was torn away and his tongue hung down over his breast. There was obviously no chance of his ever recovering, and I was filled with the pity at the thought of his certain death, and with admiration for his firmness and strength. The sight was the most impressive one during my experience in the service, and I have told the story repeatedly." So Rufus goes on, "When I told him," and he's writing this now to Aunt Francie, "that I thought it was possible that this man might have been my uncle, whose picture was before him, he could hardly accept it. But you will see from the letter which I have just received that there is no longer any doubt in his mind." I'd just like to conclude by saying that I wonder, Rufus and Ephraim both had that integrity, strength of character, and just general goodness about them. But on the battlefields, they were warriors. So what made them, so how were they grounded? And it just proved to me that both of them had, before age 10, that atmosphere at the old stone house with a loving mother, supporting aunt and uncle, supporting grandparents, supporting siblings, so that when they went off and had to live the rest of their boyhood with their father, Henry, in Malta, they had that going for them. Now you hear a lot about kids today who from broken families and parents that treat them badly. In Henry's house, I'm sure there was punishment with a hickory stick whenever they broke a rule. Ephraim talked about it. And their older brother, Henry, of course, finally confronted Henry, the father, about it and said, "You're not going to do that anymore." But I think from their father, they must have learned hard work and perseverance. And that carried them through the war, through their whole life. Because they both had the ability to form companies and work hard, but then faced with bankruptcy. Imagine doing that. In the midst of, in Rufus's case, raising 6 children. Ephraim and Francie had no children. but boy, you can see from his history here, he was a remarkable person. Sorry if I took too long. Open for any questions you might have. Thank you very much for attending.